I'm going to come in here and I'll just say your name and we can think you're from Saskatchewan.
Yeah,
and good afternoon, folks, and welcome to the OASIS Lunchtime Talk. For today, I'm Tom Apley. This talk is brought to you by the Game Lab and Centre of Excellence in Game Cultural Studies at the University of Tampere. Today, we have a guest speaker, Jean Ketterling from University of Saskatchewan in Canada. She's asked me to let her introduce herself, so I'm going to do that.
Thank you. Do I need this or just this is good? Perfect. There. Free both my hands up for hand talking, as is my way. Is this where I should be standing?
Yep.
Great. Okay. And to move it forward, I'm just going to click these buttons. Is that right? Good. Okay. Perfect. Hopefully I'm good. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be here with you today. My name is Jean Ketterling. I'm going to introduce myself in a moment, but today I am talking about rhythm, orgasm, and chrononormativity in Orgasm Simulator and NSFWare, which is the reason for the apologies to the high school students. I'll give the content note in a moment, but I'm also, because of the time allotment and also because I wanted to make it a little less formal than I'm used to in terms of these talks, I want to frame that research in the broader context of the work I've been doing on sex, the representation of sex in video games, as well as talk a little bit about how my work has been developing recently in relation to ongoing censorship or emerging censorship and its connection to sex work in Canada and the United States in relation to Steam and itch and issues like that. So I'll sort of give a bit of a formal presentation in the middle here, but I'm going to loosen it up at certain parts. So the plan today is that I'm going to situate these case studies that I'm going to present to you within my broader research project. I'm going to offer you the two case studies on Orgasm Simulator and NSFWare. And then I'm going to pivot a little bit to ask the question that I get asked a lot, which is, are these games pornography? And their relationship to porn, I'm going to argue, is both tenuous but intellectually interesting, before sort of suggesting to you that maybe that's not even the right question at this particular moment, in a moment of in which pornography is being used in my cultural context as sort of the pointy end of a wedge into a descent into fascism, arguably, as well as, ongoing censorship of pornography and sex work. And then I'm finally going to sort of make some gestures towards the importance of thinking about game preservation and the preservation of pornographic games in this particular time and how we might want to do that. So as a content note, I am, as I'm going to tell you, a pornography scholar in part, as well as game scholar. And so while there's nothing particularly explicit in this presentation, it does include frank discussions of sexuality and pornography, and animated sexual images of animated penises and breasts, etc. Okay, but because it's my first time meeting you all, and this is a new context for me, I wanted to spend a bit more time situating myself and helping, sort of giving you my context about how I come to game studies and this research specifically. So I am, as Tom has said, an assistant professor in political studies at the University of Saskatchewan. I'm in a political studies department, but I teach and research within the Women's and Gender Studies program specifically. But my PhD and my MA actually were in legal studies. So a lot of my work focuses on the governance and regulation of sex and sexuality outside of games, just more broadly, and also thinking about informal mechanisms of governance in society. I was listening to Dr. Florence Chee's talk on Monday, I think, right? Also connected to law and regulation. So there's some resonance there, which is fun for me to think about. And then before I came back to grad school, I worked in nonprofit for 7 years, and I did a bunch of different stuff there. I was a sexual health educator in rural schools, so I would do the STI and contraception talks for middle schoolers. I worked in grassroots advocacy around things like the work that was done on when Canada struck down its sex work laws, which, being here, it's like the Nordic model is the Swedish model of governance of sex work. So this idea of criminalizing clients. So I was involved in advocacy work to decriminalize sex work in Canada in solidarity with sex workers. I taught or attempted to get pornography literacy tools into schools in that region. And I also worked with an international sexual and reproductive rights organization that was dealing with or advocating around SRHR, sexual and reproductive health and rights, around the Sustainable Development Goal process. So that's sort of my background professionally. And then I came to grad school and I got into game studies and pornography studies and legal studies and the intersection of these things. And lastly, I'm the vice president of the Canadian Game Studies Association. I think that you've had like this steady stream of the executives here over the last little bit. So I'll tag someone in when I leave. But yeah, that's also part of what I'm doing right now. So to say this is how I generally explain myself, as someone who works across game, pornography, and legal studies, and with the wrapping paper, right, of feminist and queer theory throughout. And then finally, a little bit of housekeeping I want to do to sort of introduce myself as a settler scholar who lives in Canada. I want to do a land acknowledgement. So this is to acknowledge the land and the treaty obligations that come along with being a settler scholar in Canada. So I just want to quickly do this, which is to say that I'm located in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, so sort of in the middle of the middle here on Treaty 6 territory, which is the traditional territory of the Cree peoples, as well as the homeland of the Métis. And whenever my presentation today and my work more generally concerns the inequities and power dynamics, right, that are inherent in the construction and governance of sex and sexuality. And as part of land acknowledgements, I always like to start with the reminder that sex, gender, and sexuality in my cultural context are always implicated in and enmeshed with settler colonialism and the settler colonial project in so-called Canada. And so I like to start with a reminder from Dr. Alex Wilson, who is a Two-Spirit member of the Oposqueoc Cree Nation and a scholar. And they write, aggressive assimilation policies have attempted to displace Indigenous peoples' own understandings, practices, and teachings around sexuality, gender, and sexuality, and regulate Indigenous bodies along a continuum of violence. So I find this to be a helpful reminder for myself when I'm doing this work, and when we're having these debates around sex and pornography in Canada, as a reminder that these debates we come to these debates already always shaped by settler colonial relationships and violence. Okay, so the work I want to present to you today is part of a broader project that looks at how indie video games represent sex using their audio-visual haptic mechanics. I'm taking that turn of phrase from Brendan Keogh. And more importantly, how these mechanisms, how audio, visual, haptic video games rub up against and I think challenge some of pornography's genre norms, right? And pornography studies assumptions about what pornography can do. So with this project, what I'm aiming to demonstrate is that it is precisely video game limitations in relation to video pornography that incites indie game developers to use experimental aesthetic approaches that extend beyond often pornography's conventions around explicitness and sex, and that has I think political stakes. So within the increasingly homogenized, algorithmically driven pornographic landscape, right, that indie video games can make them a particularly important medium for challenging some of those homogenies, as well as promoting sort of sexual playfulness in ways that I think are really interesting. And so just to briefly say, the machines part of the title and this project is my nod towards desire and assemblage. And so I draw on queer and feminist theories of affect and embodiment. with the intent to develop an approach to analyzing sex that is based on a machinic understanding of desire that is manifested through play as a productive and a generative force and a forward-looking political practice. And here, I think maybe you, if you are familiar with Susanna Passanen's work, you might see her influence, which has been very important to my research. So just to give you a sense of the broader project, these are the games that I analyzed in my dissertation, but these are in flux, so I'm dropping some of these, I'm reworking, I'm picking up other games as I continue to work on this project post-defense. But this is sort of where the project started, and it gives you a sense of the type of games I'm looking at, right? Most of which don't fit into sort of conventionally like the bucket of conventional pornography, right? So now I want to present some of the work that I've done out of a chapter I'm working on sexual rhythm. I am going to rely a little bit more on my notes here because I don't trust my own brain enough after 2 weeks of traveling. But from this, in this portion of the work, the core concept that my research revolves around here is chrononormativity, or what Munoz calls straight time. And in straight time, Munoz argues, quote, the only futurity promised is that of reproductive majoritarian heterosexuality, the spectacle of the state refurbishing its ranks through overt and subsidized acts of reproduction. So when we talk about chrononormativity, or straight time as it's sometimes called, we are talking about a set of linear milestones that set out the path towards what Lauren Berlant calls the good life, right? So this is the heteronormative ideal of what constitutes a life well lived, or even an acceptable and a normal life. Straight time also shows up on the micro scale of individual sexual encounters. So the scholar, straight time informs what the scholar Annie Potts calls the orgasmic imperative. So the orgasmic imperative is a set of cultural expectations around orgasm that frame it as the mandatory zenith of each and every sexual encounter. And in her research on heterosexual couples and their use of another technology, Viagra, Potts demonstrates that orgasm has come to be obligatory, and that the achievement of a normal orgasm is seen as the necessary precondition for a good sexual life, or to achieve the status of even like a whole and healthy sexual being. She describes the construction of orgasm as the pinnacle She describes the construction of orgasm as a pinnacle of sexual experience and the end goal of each sexual response cycle as, quote, an insidious and consistent cultural rhythm in Western society. And as you can see here in these two graphs, one of which shows a conventional model for the sexual response cycle, the other which shows the conventional sort of like narrative arc, right? That models of narrative structure often mirror the idealized sexual response cycle, right? However, game scholar Shira Chess has argued that games offer alternative pleasures that move away from these normative, narrative, and sexual cycles. And she writes, quote, instead of getting embroiled in the escalation towards climax, video game narratives are placed firmly in moments of delay, moments of narrative middle. And so, drawing on scholars who have explored rhythm, including Chess, but also Brendan Keogh, Bo Ruberg, Aubrey Navel, Thomas Aberle, I suggest that video game rhythm, shaped by mechanics, visuals, sound, and the ways we touch and interact with games, is one of the primary ways that video games represent sex. So in other words, video games represent sex using rhythm. The way I think that sexual video games mobilize rhythm and exploit the medium's affordances for playing in the middle, as Chess puts it, rather than working towards that inevitable climax, I think can playfully reproduce or resist the orgasmic imperative. So I'm going to present my two case studies. Has anyone played Orgasm Simulator? Yes? Yeah, okay, great. So Orgasm Simulator is set in a fictional world where this handheld device here is used as a training tool by women to remedy sexual dysfunction. So mechanically, it's a rhythm game. There's no choice in terms of avatar, gender, or sexuality. This is sort of what you get. And so I must play and you must play as the woman in this heterosexual couple who is attempting to fake an orgasm. I press this big button with the little voice there to build the intensity, and here to quote, to build the intensity of my moans, and these must match the animated partners in intensity and frequency with the goal of building up to climax in time with my partner. I can win or lose this game in several ways. So these stars along the bottom of the screen measure my performance. Rhythmic resonance preserves them, and arrhythmia takes them away. I'm not doing too great right there, as you can see. Failure to find a rhythm, faking too soon or not or not at all will cause my partner to realize that I am faking and proclaim me frigid. Conversely, if I succeed at faking an orgasm at the right moment, the man is going to leap up off my supine avatar and do a little victory dance while flexing. So I find this game pretty confounding. I have mixed feelings about it. I'll admit I have a bit of a predisposition to reading it in a negative way. But today I want to offer what I think is a relatively generous reading, while also highlighting some of the game's shortcomings in relation to sexual rhythm specifically, as well as its shortcomings in terms of the critique I think it wants to make. So I think that Orgasm Simulator critiques heteronormativity best when it reveals how the orgasmic imperative, that is the mandate to orgasm in a normal way, right, poisons our capacity to understand sex as a form of play. So that is, Orgasm Simulator succeeds when it shows how faking orgasm produces what Potts calls convoluted play that more closely resembles a sort of pre-scripted, unplayful regurgitation of rote sexual scripts, regardless of the player's actual pleasure or desire. So in this way, I think Orgasm Simulator is an example of what Bo Ruberg calls re-gamification. So Orgasm Simulator's mechanics are an effort to literalize and thus reveal the unequal sexual standards applied to men and women, and how, while men, as the argument goes, may revel in sexual rhythms, women are often made responsible for a type of hypervigilant, chrononormative, rhythmic performance as opposed to play or work, right? And here I will say this is an oversimplification, right? So sexological research shows that men also fake orgasm, and others have argued there is power in faking orgasm, for example, but I want to bracket those nuances for the moment. But where I sort of get caught up more in this is that I think Orgasm Simulator also utterly ignores the pleasure that the player might truly experience through play and rhythmic resonance as part of the gaming assemblage. So at every turn, I think, Orgasm Simulator frustrates my ability to find resonant sexual rhythms and effaces the way the game might actually move me or other players. And in the logic of the video game, this pleasure doesn't matter, right? And that's the reason for that is that it's trying to make this satirical point. Moments where I might actually get caught up in the rhythms that resonate sexually. Moments where we are pulled into the audiovisual haptic sensations that feel sexual because of the way they are connected with and recirculate erotic moments from our past or our present, are dismissed in service to what I think is a rather oversimplistic satirical point, right? Orgasm, real or fake, is or the lack thereof entirely, is the singular point of this game, right? While Orgasm Simulator wants to critique sexual scripts, it can't really seem to imagine sexual possibilities outside of the chrononormative orgasmic imperative. And that brings me to NSFWare. And I want to suggest that NSFWare is better able to critique the orgasmic imperatives rhythms. Has anyone played this game? Well, I like it quite a lot, as I'll explain. So in his phenomenological study of video games, this game scholar Brendan Keogh argues that character death is an important rhythm in many video games. Building on this insight, I want to suggest that orgasm, or the normative sexual response cycle, has, I think, a similar function in sexual video games. However, like queer treatment of death, in video games, right? That they involve reanimation, looping back through time, replaying, etc. Sexual video games play with the straight time of orgasm in ways that can reveal the shortcomings of the orgasmic imperative and reveal new sexual possibilities. So in Orgasm Simulator, as I've said, orgasm is the singular goal, and orgasm, or lack thereof, will always end the game, right? That's sort of the point, and it ends the cycle. In contrast, NSFWare plays with challenges and reimagines these rhythms in what I think are politically useful ways. So NSFWare is described by its developer as WarioWare meets Pornhub. Like WarioWare, it is composed of a series of mini games, each lasting approximately 5 seconds. This interstitial clip of a person shaking their butt to like a very catchy electronic beat heralds the success of a mini game, while a clip of someone slipping down a stripper's pole announces a failure. Each level, as you see here, there are many more than this, but here are 4. Each level begins with an instruction: watch, punish, hold, tease, edge, gag, tickle, that give you or me a hint about what we should do in the minimal amount of time that I have to complete a level. The video game provides no instruction besides indicating that I should use the arrow keys to play, and so I win by playing over and over, repeating mini games, and experimenting. What is key here for me is that orgasm is not important or even represented in NSFWare. That doesn't mean that there aren't sexual rhythms. The game encourages dalliance and playing with anorgasmic rhythms and pleasures. Some particularly resonant minigames give players a small pleasurable jolt of excitement, but these last only a second, a small wave of erotic excitement that dissipates quickly into the next scene, although players might, by chance, sometimes string together a series of minigames that give them these small thrills and enjoy riding the ripples of erotic potential for a half minute or more. So Potts writes that by de-emphasizing orgasm, we create a potential space for sex, which has no preset goal in mind or body, which follows no set that is sexologically dictated sequence, but which enjoys the possibility of desire sex, which is not just a mode of suspension, deferring an inevitable endpoint, but sex which pleasures in the sexiness of desire, sex without a primary orgasmic mission. So fundamentally, NSFWare is a video game about sex that values the rhythmic texture of experimentation, failure, and repetition. There is no ending. Players play repetitively, looping through cycles over and over, riding waves of pleasure that never break onto the orgasmic shore. It is a video game, I want to suggest, that exists entirely in what Shira Chess calls the queer narrative middle. NSFWare shakes the normative linear rhythms of the orgasmic imperative to trace new rhythms, new tempos through a sexual landscape that has long been shaped by the topologies of the heteronormative and biomedical sexual response cycle. And so here I want to pivot a little bit because this, again, as I've suggested, these case studies are part of a broader project in which I'm looking at how video games put pressure on ocular-centric, that is visual-centric, conceptualizations of pornography. But this raises the question, I think the legitimate question of how these games, which are indie, often political, sometimes identified as art games by their developers, how they even relate to porn at all. So like, what is their relationship to porn? And I want to talk about that a little bit. I think this is a visual gag that only plays if you're maybe a Canadian or American legal scholar. This is Justice Potter Stewart, who coined the infamous "I'll know it when I see it" in a case around pornography. So to give you the background, but I want to move from this talking about these case studies to talking a little bit about like what is the relationship of these games to pornography and why does it matter? And you know, there's a lot. I think maybe this group of folks in this context likely knows that there's a lot of really interesting practical and theoretical overlaps between game and pornography, right? That we have some shared investments and there's useful theoretical overlap, but there's also friction, right? And as game scholars, including folks here, have argued, game scholars can be a bit squeamish or awkward about sex, right? Although I think in my experience, this is changing over time. But in my own work, at least in the North American context, I've also found that pornography scholars can be a bit dismissive of games, right? Especially of games like this that I'm talking about. And they often, again, I'm generalizing here, apologies to porn scholars watching, this is a generalization, but can also really resist the idea that video games are pornography. And I think that like this is connected to a lot of what we as game scholars are dealing with as a field, right? This idea that games are an immature medium, that they're for children, that they are niche rather than mainstream, et cetera, all of which I think maybe fuels some of this discomfort. But I think the other thing is that part of this dismissal, right, or the lack of attention to video games within pornography studies is connected to the way pornography is defined and conceptualized. So as Andrews has put it, the definition of pornography is so intractable, right, that it famously resulted in Justice Potter Stewart's like fumbling adage that he would know it when he saw it, right? It's not the world's best solution to that problem. But we in some ways, we don't necessarily have a better one either. So I want to, in this section of the talk, think through that definition a little bit and the ways in which the way we conventionally define pornography causes some problems in relation to the field. And it is 12:25. Is my clock here correct? Okay. So increasingly, we have this whole range of sexual video games, right? From mainstream titles to indie, from games that are in line with the genre norms of mainstream pornography, right? Things that are very much like House Party up here, things that are like using the visual language, the tropes, the narratives of mainstream mass-produced pornography, to things like Robert Yang's games or Luxurious Superbia that really don't arguably resemble mainstream pornography at all, or are very, very different. And on top of that, we lay on top, right, the nuances of the video game industry, video games' own genre norms, right? So not only pornographic genre, but then video game genre, and the intricacies of video game distribution platforms or things like Patreon, right, that are fueling some of this creation. And this all starts to look like a pretty messy picture, right? And I think this is why we have to sort of engage with this definition of pornography with a bit more purpose. So then we end up at this question of what is pornography, right? And scholars haven't necessarily been more successful than Justice Potter Stewart in actually defining that. So for example, Ashton and colleagues find that within the social sciences papers on porn that they surveyed, 67% don't even provide a definition of porn, right? So we are also, as pornography scholars, are like, it's tricky, right? Among those that do, though, they demonstrate that there is a common set of criteria used to define pornography. And this is something that McKee et al. Also demonstrate in their 2020 article, in which they survey 38 scholars using a Delphi panel. And they suggest that there are two sort of parallel definitions of pornography with these components. So the first is sexually explicit material intended to arouse, right? You'll see this reproduced in a lot of places. And second is a more culturally relative and contextual definition that recognizes that what counts as porn is a product of specific knowledge and power structure, right? So this is a much more contingent definition that sort of would suggest that pornography can change dramatically over time. And while I think, these two definitions are to some extent in tension, McKee et al. Show that actually most pornography scholars keep both in play, right? And they both keep them in play in order to, as they write, to balance complexity as well as operational necessity, right? We want to maintain complexity, but at some point we do have to define the damn thing in order to make conclusions about it to some extent. So what is the relationship of these definitions that are in use in pornography studies to game studies? So why does this matter to game scholars, basically? I want to walk through the components there and talk through some of the challenges associated with those definitions on my work and maybe on yours. So first, most definitions of pornography share a focus on explicitness, on fully revealing something sexual. So Ashton and colleagues finds that explicitness is often conceptualized as a content issue in the social sciences literature. So they write, quote, "The content of pornography includes genitals, clear images of nudity, masturbation, oral sex, anal sex, vaginal intercourse, genitals, and people having sex." Arguably, I think in that definition, you might see or say that explicitness is functionally about the visual, right? Specifically, the realism and the documentary capacity of live action sexual representation. And I think these are narrow, and I'm going to suggest ocular-centric definitions or boundaries, and other scholars have argued something similar. So in her work on Japanese erotic comics and anime, Aurélie Petit, who's at Concordia, I believe, argues that hentai is often, quote, "not perceived as a legitimate form of visual sexual culture," right? So we sort of see these content boundaries sort of taking shape. Similarly, a definition rooted in visual explicitness will tend to exclude video games, I think, is my experience of it at least, which rarely match conventional pornography's graphic realism and are thus easily framed as a juvenile substitute. We're all familiar with this idea for real sex and real porn. That is, that video game porn is not as serious, people aren't seeking it out, et cetera, because it's a poor substitute for quote unquote real sex, right? So it might be something else entirely. It might be erotica, but it's not pornography. And I think we could take, for example, go back to the House Party, which is this game up here, which again, I think is pretty recognizable as a pornographic video game. But in many ways, you know, it mirrors conventional pornography's language, its sex acts, its sort of tropes. But as we well know, right, hands will clip into penises, the movement of bodies is jerky, audio loops sometimes in ways that sort of can take you out of the sort of, that's different from real humans, essentially. So judged on visuals alone, arguably House Party can't compete with live action pornography. Similarly, games like La Petite Mort, which is, maybe I don't have a photo of it, but it's the cover image that I am using here. It's also like it trades explicit, like what we think about as visual explicitness for abstraction, right? And arguably it also fails to meet the condition of sexually explicit material if explicitness is culturally constructed as a predominantly visual characteristic. Someone like Michael C. Rea, who's a philosopher who has written on the definition of pornography, he focuses on communicative content, right, which I think is helpful in shifting the rhetoric away from visual explicitness to sort of a broader set of like how is sex communicated, or how is explicitness communicated in audio, rhythm, etc., abstract graphics, right? So the other problem with these definitions, as I see it, is that most definitions rely on the idea that pornography is produced with the primary intention of turning people on, right? And this shows up in a couple different ways. So Action and colleagues writing about Grand Theft Auto 5 argue that arousal is a byproduct, not the primary intention, and that the game's primary intentions, that is entertainment, reward, quest completion, distinguish a game with so-called pornographic content from pornography. So I think this is, to some extent this is fair in Grand Theft Auto 5, right? We might not want to call that game pornography in and of itself, right? They might have pornographic elements, which is the argument people make about the relationships you can have with sex workers. But I do think that using Grand Theft Auto 5 as the example here risks, again, oversimplifying games or misunderstanding games if we hold that definition up too rigidly. So even the most sexually explicit, like as we might call them, one-handed games, right? Games designed for masturbation, are also games, right? They are made with the intention of being fun and entertaining. And to make a successful pornographic video game, developers approach making games with the intention to arouse, so a pornographic intention, right, to arouse people, but also to amuse players. They are making a game. Similarly, players arguably choose to seek out video game pornography amidst like the plethora of free live action pornography that exists, right? So this suggests, to me at least, that they're looking for both games that are good games to some extent, and good porn, right? Or else they would just turn to live action. Another issue with this definition, or this component of the definition, is how we as viewers and players might expect the intention to arouse to manifest in a finished product, right? So this is the cultural aspect. That is, we might expect materials intended to arouse to look and sound a certain way without recognizing that these expectations themselves are culturally constructed and shift over time. They're context dependent. So we might have a harder time imagining that a game like La Petite Mort, which again, here's the quote from that, I'm going to cover this in a minute, a very abstracted game that does use real photographs of vulvas, but that has been sort of abstracted out to be like relatively indistinct, I would say, and uses touch-based, haptic-based sort of mechanics to allow you to, again, achieve orgasm. We sort of have a harder time thinking about a game like that as pornography, or even more so, Pip and Bars, It Is As If You Were Making Love, which is a game about sliding a slider. Have folks played Pip and Bars game, maybe? It's also really interesting. But again, it's about interfaces and sliders, and it is, to sort of call it a pornographic video game can be a bit strange, arguably. However, even though we have a harder time maybe thinking about these games as pornography or as in the bucket of pornography, their developers are situating them really clearly within this idea of the intent to arouse. So one of La Petite Mort's designers is emphatic that the game, quote, should not be regarded as an educational game about pleasuring vulvas. It is quite an erotic experience. It is meant to be sensuous, erotic, and artistic. And similarly, Pip and Bar, his design documentation reveals a continuous concern with designing a game that with the absolutely, and here I'm quoting, central design goal that the game feels genuinely erotic, right? So while these games might not be, I think, easily recognizable as pornography or even as erotica, right? Their designers are thinking about them as being in conversation with those things. So ultimately, where I like to land and where I think we might be more productively land is in this idea that what counts as porn is a product of specific knowledge and power structures. And as Atwood and Smith here write, that these changes in production and technology, including changes in pornographic production that come with games, that if we think about those, we can raise new questions that have really important, we as game scholars can raise really interesting questions that are important for pornography scholars to consider and conceptualize, and that raise, like once again, even bigger questions about sex and sexuality in the current moment. So ultimately, in relation to this project, I'm sort of landing here. So first, that indie video games maybe sit uneasily on the bounds or the margins of pornography, but what they do is challenge those ocular-centric conceptualizations of pornography. And then second, that if there's political utility, I think, in having sort of a big tent approach to pornography, to thinking about the ways that these things, even on the margins, are usefully thought of as pornographic, and in so doing, that is, I think, a theoretically and politically generative approach. Okay, but in the couple minutes I have left, I have timing.
Yeah.
Great.
You can keep going if you want, as far as
Okay. I'll take a couple more minutes. I'm interested in talking to you folks about this, so I want to try to keep it tighter. But so I presented this academic, like my work in this project is quite theory heavy, right? It's all post-playing textual analysis in the sort of pornography studies mode. But sort of where I'm at right now, the like payment processors don't put under that, right? Like part of what's going on in this current moment is that I've been in my little academic bubble for a while, and then over the summer, payment processors sort of crushed. Well, I'll nuance that. Anyway, we sort of had this issue. So what happened, right, is that to some extent, like how I define pornography, my arguments about including these video games in porn studies, are all, I think, important and theoretically and politically useful. But again, we're sort of at this point where the rubber is hitting the road in terms of deplatforming. So for those of you who don't, are folks, just to give me are you familiar with what happened with Steam and Itch over the summer? Yes, okay. So for those who don't know, just a very quick overview. This summer, an Australian anti-pornography organization was engaged in a campaign that encouraged payment processors. So I didn't put the graphic here, but payment processors in terms of Stripe, MasterCard, Visa, but also the whole network, financial network, infrastructure network that sort of acts as intermediaries. So I'm just going to call that payment processors. It's an oversimplification, but so all of that Australian organization, Collective Shout, lobbied payment processors to take certain games that they saw as promoting sexual violence off of Steam and Itch. As a result, payment processors did what payment processors have been doing for decades, which is to force those platforms to update their policies on sexual content in such a way that has resulted in a lot of NSFW content, adult content, lewd content, however you want to call it, coming off the platform. This affected Itch more acutely, right? Itch pulled basically all NSFW content off of platforms for a period of time. Some of it is back as long as it's free, so it's not engaging with those payment processors. Steam was able to sort of have a more measured response, right? They are more powerful, they have more lawyers. But there's also been ongoing sort of drama about like the way that they're treating pornography. So as a legal scholar, right, this is where a lot of my energy is going right now, in part because I think it's critical to frame these debates, which are being driven by Australian feminists, informed by North American porn war discourse and rhetoric, a la sort of McKinnon and Dworkin, right, and that sort of whole history. I think it's critical to frame what's going on with Steam and Itch in that legal studies, sexuality studies history, and the way that English-speaking feminists who are applying pressure are part and parcel of what my colleague Val Weber calls this de facto global censorship regime, right? That North American sex exceptional approaches to sex and sexuality are now being used on these global platforms to govern sex very broadly. I think the other really important thing for us as game scholars and game players is to recognize that what's happening with Steam and Itch, I didn't show you my lovely screenshot. What's happening with Steam and Itch has been happening to sex workers for decades, right? None of this is new. The approach, sex workers have been ringing the alarm about the power of payment processors over formal law, over national law, the power of payment processors to determine who can and can't make a living, their power in terms of this broad definition of, well, obscenity effectively that far exceeds most national standards of obscenity. They've been drawing attention to this for decades and on the way it's affecting their material ability to survive. So I think there's this, as game scholars, it's a time for us to sort of think about that and our relationship, again, to pornography, sexuality studies, but also to sex workers, right, and the folks who are doing this work. So here's just a collection, right? So thousands of adult titles disappeared. The UK government says that they have, right, the governments, my government, the UK, the States, none of them are really interested in intervening, right? So these payment processors are arguably governing on their behalf, right? So national obscenity law in Canada, for example, doesn't really matter anymore. It's all payment processors that are really the key driving force here, but the government is not going to get involved in that. And then, I mean, it's just like I believe CEO of Collective Shout claimed victory against porn sick, brain rotted pedo gamer fetishists, right? So it's sort of like conceptualization, right, of gamers as the worst of the worst. Okay, so that's sort of the current situation and where my head is at. But I think the other thing I want to flag is that all of this raises really important questions about the preservation of pornographic video games as cultural heritage. And so most of us are, I think, probably aware of this statistic, right, from the Video Game History Foundation, that 87% of classic video games are sort of missing and unstudyable because they're gone or just not available. But I think this raises, like, the theme and itch issue, and the payment processor really reinforces the importance of this in relation to pornographic video games. So I'm really lucky that I've just started some work with my really brilliant colleagues, Dr. Michael Iantorno and Danny Gay Belanger, on video game preservation. They're sort of experts and much more, have much more expertise than I do in game preservation. So I'm happy to be working with them to sort of think about sex, the preservation of sexual video games. I'm interested in hearing from you what the context is here, because at least in my context, we started talking to video game preservationists and archivists when this situation happened, and they're a bit reticent about archiving pornographic video games. And I think a lot of the formal institutions that do video game preservation work are relatively conservative, like small c conservative. They're sort of, they want to preserve things that are child friendly, that are family friendly, that are non-controversial, that funders won't get mad about, right? And so I think what this ends up doing is creating a really vulnerable archive in relation to pornographic video games, right? So we really risk losing a lot of this content, especially with payment processor intervention. And so I think this raises the question of, like, how can we work with the folks who are doing this work in porn preservation? And, you know, that's like these folks, right? So I'm sort of more, I am at this point really interested in conversations around the folks who've been working to preserve porn for a long time. So this is the Leather Archive and Museum, Archives and Museum in Chicago, that produces or preserves a lot of BDSM kink sort of content and heritage and culture. And then the Mark Bonham Center for Sexual Diversity Studies, which is an institute out of the University of Toronto, which has a really great sexual representation archive that collects pornography, but also like ephemera of various types related to porn. And like these are the folks who have no qualm, obviously, about preserving pornography. There's a conversation to be had, I think, right, about the nuances of preserving games, because as I think we all know, that's complicated. And so how do we come together to sort of share knowledge and share tactics and work with these people who have, I think, who do really important and challenging work of defending the importance of porn and sex in archives, right? These archives that are often conceptualized as very risky. And so just to close, I want to talk just very briefly about where my work is headed in this particular climate. So Steam and Itch, right, implemented those new policy guidelines the week after I was awarded federal funding to study platform governance on Steam and Itch. So it was like great timing. My summer was busy. So that's what I'm currently doing now through this project called the Pornography Platforms and Play Project. So we are going to be doing a survey, interviews, and game jams with pornographic, sexual, lewd, erotic game makers. Just a flag for you, if you know folks who are affected by the platform policy changes on Steam and Itch, I'm going to be releasing a survey when I get back to Canada that is aiming to understand how those folks were affected in that time. But I've also been working with colleagues, and I'm always looking to work with more colleagues on porn and games, including stuff like with Ashley Guajardo, Carl Terry, and Kenzie Gordon. We wrote this piece of conversation about deplatforming. We got a nice little response from Collective Shout for that piece. We recently organized a 2-hour panel all about sex, money, and censorship, and bringing sex and pornography researchers together to talk about these issues and to historicize them, to give them context. The audio for this is available from me personally if you'd like to listen to it. We'll get it up at some point. And then also I was interviewed by Chris Plant in Post Games, again, to historicize what's happening with deplatforming. So yeah, that's sort of where I'm at now. I think there's a lot of sort of, again, politically necessary work to be done by game scholars working with sexuality and pornography scholars right now. I'm always very open to that. But I've thrown like a huge amount of it, so I'm very interested in chatting with you, and thank you again for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Right, so we are allowed to throw the mic today. I see you, Mark.
Thank you for your input, and you are a great speaker.
Thank you.
With 40 hours.
Oh no, I missed my flight.
Genuine mistake. Sorry. When you were talking about orgasm simulator,
Yeah.
you mentioned that sometimes you are not sure about your opinion of it, whether you have a positive or negative
Yeah.
perception. of
Yeah.
it. Then I thought about Halberstam's work on failure and Ruber's work on failure. Well, mainly when the game fails, either because the player is playing poorly or because something really fails, then the way we can read the game changes.
Yeah.
Sometimes suddenly that pornographic content becomes potentially feminist. Perhaps. And so, yeah, I'm currently thinking about asynchronous. So I'm currently thinking about things that not work in time. And I am wondering how does the way we read pornographic games change when they fail? Either because they're working in an awkward, in a weird way, in a way they're not intended, or because the players are playing poorly.
Yeah, great question. Thank you for that. I think it's a big question. I guess the way I would answer it is I think you're spot on. So I do in all my work, especially around interpreting sex, like I'm always trying to keep the multiple ways that someone can read this alive. Like I don't think there's a right interpretation of this game. I'm really interested in these tensions. I do think it was interesting to me in terms of playing this game. I did have a first sort of gut like response to it, which I've been really working actively to try to unpack. And I think part of that for me and how that shows up in my work is that I use like BDSM kink as a framework for a lot of my analysis, right? And I think that piece of me, right, is always interested in sort of like the bratty rejection of the dominant reading of something, right? So I'm very interested in thinking about that. And I think failure is one way to do it. I think kink is another. There's lots of ways to keep those things alive, but I'm gonna have to think on that a bit more, but thank you.
That one of the people affected by some of the blood work changes.
Okay.
I know very much what you still all the comments from the person that affected directly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is what drives my curiosity regarding one of the things. Like, I have a lot to say. But one thing that I was pointed at, and I was kind of seeing in changes with other platforms too, because I think Patreon was kind of affected by the same changes by similar waves in the past. There is a type of the content that I noticed is not really affected by most of the payment processors changes of term use, which is normative heterosexual content. Am I biased?
No.
Or is it something that does exist and keeps getting worse?
Yeah, great question. So I say no. So I will say I will let you know when the data comes back is part of it. So like in terms of if what you want is the data, then you'll have to wait. But what I will say is my response to that is always from a legal studies perspective, from the historical understanding of how these laws operate, queer people are always more affected. That's, again, it's not new. It's old. Pornography law, obscenity law has long been used to maintain heteronormativity. So we shouldn't be surprised, right? Of course, we know this, that when queer content is more affected. In the Canadian context, we actually have like a series of cases, but one very important case called Little Sisters, which is a bookshop versus Canada, in which the government basically demonstrated, or like not the government had to, respond to allegations that Border Patrol was more harshly targeting queer content. So again, this is way back. So there's nothing new there, I think. But for game scholars, I think again, sometimes it's about making those connections, especially if we haven't had this. I think there's more depth of engagement here, possibly with sexuality studies. But yeah, no, you're not wrong from a theoretical standpoint. I think to be determined what happens on these platforms, but I do think that that's real. The other connection I would make is that, as Ashley Guajardo has talked about in that panel, like pornography, definitions of pornography are purposefully politically slippery. So right now what we're seeing in the States, which is important in terms of the legal context, right, is that with Project 2025, this Document Heritage Foundation, that's sort of a roadmap for the Trump administration, there is a explicit call for pornography to be redefined, right, as, big scare quotes here, transgender ideology, right? So pornography is no longer actually visually explicit content intended to arouse, rather it's the existence of queer and specifically trans people, right? And then there's an explicit call to criminalize and incarcerate pornographers. So there's an explicit political dimension of that right now happening in the States, but obviously because of platform context, that's going to seep out everywhere. Thanks.
Maybe we'll up there.
In the what was the fact that kind of why people would choose kind of playing a game over watching live action porn. Games also kind of needing to be good games, but something that.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of wondering, like, my sort of assumption based on not a huge amount of experience is that porn games might not be particularly ambitious as games. So I was just sort of thinking, like should we kind of see porn games as just sort of like a genre of porn, like just like an interactive flavor of porn.
Yeah.
Like for people who are playing porn games, as opposed to live action porn, like whether it's just the case of it being interactive rather than it being kind of very interesting as a game as such.
Yeah. No, thank you. I think that's a good point. And I mean, so again, I think part of it is that part of the limitation of doing humanities-based research that is close play and textual analysis is that I can't tell you how players are thinking about that yet. I'm hoping some of that will emerge in this next project. But yeah, like, I mean, the other thing is lots of folks have complained about, especially including with AI, that like there's a growing number of sort of like bad porn games coming out that aren't particularly good games. So it's not to say they all are good or that they're all interesting or thoughtful or, good games. But I do think like my question, I guess, for players would be this idea of like why that versus, versus sort of conventional pornography. I do think I've been getting questions a lot lately about gooning. Like, I don't know that I'm like in the right space, or like I don't have the knowledge to be able to fully address that. But I do wonder about like relationship between certain like kink practices and interactivity. I wonder about like just like people's media consumption habits. So if you're already consuming a game, it might just be easier to like a non-pornographic RPG. It might be easier to just slide into pornographic games when you're already on Steam, and Steam now has giant amounts of pornography on it, versus like switching something over. But I don't really know, I think is my answer. But I think those prompts are like important areas for future inquiry. Thank you. Thank you all for having me.